I would like to welcome you to the Dahrendorf Memorial Lecture. It is a great honor for me to be part of this session on Ukraine's resistance and the future of democracy, held by the founding president of the National Endowment for Democracy, Dr. Karl Gershman. Dr. Karl Gershman, as you all know, I think, has been dedicating his work, and I would say his life, in promoting and encouraging the spirit and values of freedom and democracy in the world. So we are greatly privileged to have him with us this afternoon and to count on his friendship and cooperation towards our institute for so many years. Thank you so much, Dr. Gershman. The floor is yours. I'm
going to
yes, okay.
Okay, good. Thank you very much, Rita. And João, it's a great pleasure to be here to deliver this lecture at this very, very important time. I was in the last session listening to it, and I'm sure there's not anyone among us today who's not aware that the world has changed drastically in the past few months as a result of the Russian invasion of Ukraine on February 24th and the unexpectedly fierce Ukrainian resistance. The invasion came at a moment of deep and widespread pessimism about the future of democracy. In an article in the Journal of Democracy in January, Larry Diamond warned that this is the darkest moment for freedom in half a century, with democracy imperiled by a global resurgence of authoritarianism and increased collaboration of the authoritarians to advance authoritarian norms and interests. This apprehension peaked on February 4th, when Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping signed a joint statement that formally established a no-limits strategic partnership between Russia and China to expand their global influence in what they called, ironically, it would soon turn out, a new era of profound transformation. They had no way of knowing, of course, that the invasion of Ukraine, which Putin delayed launching as a favor to Xi until immediately after the conclusion of the Beijing Olympics, and that this would give the idea of a new era a very different meaning than the one that Xi and Putin had intended. And so it did. As Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky told the joint session of the U.S. Congress in March, Russia's aggression unleashed a terror Europe had not seen in 80 years. The invasion transformed the geopolitics of Europe. It revitalized NATO, the NATO alliance, whose defensive raison d'etre had been questioned since the end of the Cold War. It united the United States and its European allies on an agenda of aiding Ukraine, imposing sweeping financial and economic sanctions on Russia, and ending Western dependence on Russian oil and gas. And it impelled Germany to break with almost 7 decades of military diffidence and perpetual rapprochement with the Soviet Union and then later with Putin's Russia by dramatically increasing its defense spending and agreeing to provide Ukraine with heavy weapons and other military equipment. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz called the invasion a Zeitenwende, a watershed moment that signified the turning of an era. If the Russian invasion signaled the beginning of a new era of greater vigilance in defending Western security, Ukraine's courageous resistance to the invasion had the effect of reviving democratic morale after an extended period of democratic crisis and seemingly inexorable authoritarian advance. Instead of appeasement and backsliding, which had been the standard response to authoritarian bullying before then, the Ukrainian people stood up and fought back with far more courage, resilience, and success than anyone had expected. Just 2 weeks into the war, Francis Fukuyama, boldly, if perhaps a bit prematurely, predicted that Ukraine would win the war and that a Russian defeat would make possible a new birth of freedom and get us out of our funk about the declining state of democracy. The spirit of 1989 still lives, he said, thanks to a bunch of brave Ukrainians. Larry Diamond, who was a bit more cautious, but also more hopeful than he had been before, said that if the United States and other democracies provided Ukraine with sufficient support and took certain other steps to strengthen their democracy and security, the present moment could present a possible hinge of history as significant as 1989, and it might even launch a new wave of democratic progress. Luke Way, writing in the same journal, proclaimed that the invasion and the resistance had given the world's democrats renewed purpose and unity and resolve, and could ultimately strengthen even the liberal order itself, the liberal world order. The renewed hopefulness was such that Alexander Cooley took to the pages of Foreign Affairs to warn against a new irrational exuberance that overlooked many of the continuing obstacles to liberal change. Ukraine's Zelensky quickly emerged as the most powerful and eloquent voice, linking Ukraine's struggle for survival to the defense of universal democratic values. This is not a war of two armies, he said. This is a war of two worldviews. He has spoken about this war in universal terms, telling the U.S. Congress that the Ukrainian people are defending not only Ukraine, we are fighting for the values of Europe and the world, sacrificing our lives in the name of the future. I think that Ralph Dahrendorf, after whom this lecture has been named, would have strongly supported Ukraine's struggle against dictatorship and aggression, and he would have appreciated its universal significance. He was sent by the Nazis to a German concentration camp in Poland when he was just 15 years old for having engaged in anti-Nazi activities. And as a young sociologist, he was torn between scholarly detachment and political engagement. But Dahrendorf eventually resolved that modern sociologists had to be both, had the theoretical task of considering how a modern, open, civilized society should look and what paths lead to such a society, but they also had the moral responsibility, he wrote, to take part in the processes of transforming reality. I believe that not only would he have strongly supported Ukraine's resistance, but he would have also understood the relationship between its success on the battlefield, such as it has been until now, and its commitment to democracy and an open society. An example of this relationship is the importance that Ukraine that its military has attached to the principle of subsidiarity, which Dahrendorf considered to be an essential feature of an open society. Subsidiarity means that the central authority should perform only those tasks that cannot be performed at a more local level. Essentially, it's decentralization. In the military context, this principle translates into training soldiers to think for themselves so that they can adapt quickly to the situation on the ground. It also involves non-commissioned officers serving as links between commanders and ground forces, as well as something called mission command, where the senior officers set combat goals and then devolve tactical decisions as far down the chain of command as is possible. This principle is established doctrine in Western militaries. Can you get the water that I have? The water. This principle is established doctrine in Western militaries. And as the Wall Street Journal reported recently, 8 NATO countries have introduced this principle into Ukraine's military by training 10,000 Ukrainian troops annually since the first phase of the war in Ukraine began in 2014, with Russia's intervention in the Donbass in the aftermath of the Euromaidan and Putin's seizure of Crimea. The frontline battle experience of the Ukrainians in the Donbass at that time, that battle experience, according to the journal report, made the Ukrainian troops sponges for NATO training. And the result was that Ukraine's military was transformed over the last 8 years from a rigid, top-down, Soviet-styled army where the troops at the bottom are treated as cannon fodder, just taking orders from above, into an agile force that has been able to outmaneuver the Russian aggressors. The Ukrainian historian Serhiy Plohy, who we'll hear from tomorrow in an interview that Miroslava Gongadze has conducted, called this transformation the miracle on the Dnieper River, that produced an army, he said, that no one ever knew existed before, fighting the most feared army in the world and winning. It's now more than 4 months into this war, and we need to ask if Ukraine is in fact winning and if it will be able to expel the Russian aggressor over the longer term. It's widely agreed that Ukraine didn't just win the first 3 months of the war, but that Russia lost in what Anders Åslund called one of the most spectacular failures in contemporary military history. A searing briefing on the war in The Economist called the invasion a disaster for Russian armed forces, which lost 15,000 troops in the first 2 months of the war, according to British intelligence, as many as were lost in Afghanistan over an entire decade. Describing just how rotten, and that's a quote, the Russian army has been, The Economist noted that much of Russia's large defense budget is squandered or stolen, that senior army officers were kept in the dark about Putin's invasion, reflecting a crippling lack of trust, that disaffected troops have deserted their vehicles, that units have tortured, raped, and murdered only to be honored by the Kremlin, that Russia's frustrated generals wallowing in corruption and unable to foster initiative or to learn from their mistakes have fallen back on the barbaric practice of flattening cities and terrorizing civilians. This report didn't even mention that 12 of these generals have been killed, an unheard of number, because they didn't, like the Ukrainians, have non-commissioned officers. And therefore, they had to deploy to the front line to command their troops and were killed. It is this inept and criminal war that led the Russian diplomat Boris Bondarev to resign his post last month in Geneva, saying that he had never been so ashamed of his country and that Putin's aggressive war is not only a crime against the Ukrainian people, but also against the people of Russia. With the Russians having failed to take Kiev and Kharkiv, as well as Mykolaiv, which had been the path to Odessa, Putin decided to change course in April. He gave the reins of military operations in Ukraine to Alexander Dvornikov, aka the Butcher of Aleppo, who had been involved earlier in razing the Chechen capital of Grozny. And he regrouped the tired and battered forces, Russian forces, by concentrating them in the east with the goal of occupying the entire Donbass region. Such a definitive, if more limited, victory, it was hoped, would reverse the momentum of the war, send the message that the Russians had recovered their strength, and break the will of the Ukrainian resistance and its Western backers. But this gambit has also failed. The New York Times reported last month that senior U.S. officials believe, and this is a quote, that the Russian military, beaten down and demoralized after 3 months of war, is making the same mistakes in its campaign to capture a swath of eastern Ukraine that forced it to abandon its push to take the entire country. Despite having an overwhelming advantage in artillery that they used to level Severodonetsk and pummel its Ukrainian defenders, the Russians never succeeded, after more than 2 months of fighting, in encircling the Ukrainian forces. And whatever success they had in that siege of Severodonetsk, and in pushing the Ukrainians back, has cost them dearly. According to the former U.S. General and CIA Director David Petraeus, Russian losses every day in the Donbass have been greater than the U.S. and all the coalition forces suffered during the worst month of the surge in Iraq. Brookings military specialist Pavel Bayev has said that the Russian tactical gains in the Donbass may actually bring strategic defeat closer, a view shared by Petraeus, who predicted just recently on CNN that Ukraine would launch a counteroffensive after Russia had spent its forces in the Donbass, and that Ukraine would ultimately win the war. In May, Putin dismissed Dvornikov amid reports of his excessive drinking and lack of trust among the Russian forces, in addition to the ongoing dysfunction in the Kremlin's conduct of the war. Russia's troubles should in no way deflect from Ukraine's almost unimaginable suffering in the war. It has lost thousands of soldiers, many of them the most devoted of its youth, who embodied hope for the country's future. Tens of thousands of civilians have also been killed, and many millions of others have become refugees or been internally displaced. The economy, of course, has also been shattered and is expected to contract this year by almost 1/2. This has taken a terrible toll on Ukraine's military and society. But Ukraine's will to resist has not flagged. It has a 30-day waiting list of people wanting to enter military service. And Ukraine is actually having trouble training all the new recruits. It's remarkable. Meanwhile, Putin has been unable to repair his damaged war machine and did not use his so-called victory speech on May the 9th to order a general mobilization to replace heavy personnel losses because he knew that such a move would be deeply unpopular, especially in the major cities. There have been dozens of arson and Molotov cocktail attacks on military induction centers in Russia, and Russian mill bloggers have documented judicial proceedings against soldiers and officers who have deserted or refused orders to fight. Such severe morale and manpower problems raise questions about Russia's ability to sustain a war of attrition. Though Ukraine is smaller and has suffered so badly, it can sustain such a war, I believe, because it is fighting a whole of society struggle to defend its homeland and for national survival. Its frontline troops are backed up by partisan warriors in occupied areas in the south, whose acts of sabotage and assassination include even a seemingly friendly old lady in Izium, who, according to an Economist report, killed 8 Russian soldiers by feeding them poisoned pies. Ukraine also has a vibrant civil society that is doing everything from documenting war crimes to coordinating humanitarian assistance. Civil society has even been able to work on the front lines, as in the case of one activist early in the Donbass siege, when many wounded Ukrainian soldiers were dying of blood loss. And she got a hold of NATO standard first aid equipments, taught medics how to use them, and thereby helped dramatically reduce Ukrainian losses. The war could now be reaching a turning point. Since the Ukrainians have only just received and been trained to use the first of 20 multiple launch rocket systems that will give them the ability that they haven't had until now to target and destroy the artillery that Russia has amassed in fixed positions. That's how they do it, and it's an inviting target. It's expected that Ukraine will launch a major counteroffensive sometime this summer, with the goal of reversing the gains that Russia has made in the Donbass and liberating the territories that Russia has occupied in the south. They can win this war, but only if the West remains solidly behind them, providing the military help that they need in sufficient quantities and sustained over time that will enable them to regain the momentum that they had in the conflict's early phase. Portugal's role in this, I think, has been exemplary. Prime Minister Costa's visit last month to Irpin, which, like Bucha, suffered unspeakable atrocities, which he witnessed. And this was an important act of moral and political solidarity. He not only condemned what he called the barbaric Russian invasion, but pledged continued military and humanitarian support and offered to help in the reconstruction of Ukraine's schools and its kindergartens. Speaking with emotion, he declared that Portugal stands for Ukraine and that Ukraine's European choice must be greeted with open arms. That choice has now been affirmed last week by the European Union, which made Ukraine an official candidate to join the bloc. While it will take years of negotiations before Ukraine becomes an actual member state of the EU, this is already a huge defeat for Russia. which started the war in 2014 because the revolution of dignity in Ukraine signaled Ukraine's determination to become part of Europe. By giving Ukraine candidate status, Europe is now tied to that determination as it has never been before. And it has a stake in Ukraine's joining, not as a broken country, crippled by frozen conflicts in Russian-occupied territories, but as a secure, sovereign, and democratic state. When I attended a conference in Ukraine in 2014 after the Euromaidan revolution, I was struck when the Swedish Prime Minister Carl Bildt called Ukraine, and this is 2014, the epicenter of the global struggle for democracy. He didn't elaborate on the point, but I've quoted it many times since, and I think it's even more relevant today than it was then. Ukraine's vote for independence in December 1991 precipitated the collapse of the Soviet Union, which Putin famously called the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. Putin and the current Russian establishment hope to reverse that catastrophe and restore the Russian Empire and even to expand it, which Putin once suggested is his larger aim when he said that the borders of Russia, and this is a direct quote, the borders of Russia never end. The restoration of the Russian and Soviet empire in the post-colonial era seems like an insane goal, especially now that Russia is not only a shrunken power, but is politically isolated, economically in decline, militarily far weaker than had been previously assumed, and facing an existential demographic crisis that has been intensified by the flight since February 24th of hundreds of thousands of students and middle-class professionals. Yet it still remains a danger to its neighbors and to international security, using its energy resources for political leverage and blackmail, and its nuclear bullying to paralyze opposition to its expansion. An independent Ukraine has always been the principal obstacle to Russian imperialism. Zbigniew Brzezinski said many times that Russia cannot be an empire without Ukraine. And Putin made clear in his essay last July on the historical unity of Russia and Ukraine that an independent Ukraine, and this is a quote, is comparable in its consequences to the use of weapons of mass destruction against Russia. Meaning that Russia cannot survive as a country and a civilization if it does not control Ukraine. There is simply no compromise solution to end this war that can last. If Russia is allowed to remain in control of any territories occupied by the invasion, this will defeat the principle that aggression does not pay, that might does not make right, and that rules and laws matter. A Russian-controlled gray zone in Ukraine would be a launching pad for future acts of aggression, and not just against Ukraine. A Russian defeat, on the other hand, and a Ukrainian victory, would also have broad political implications for the future of democracy. It would weaken Russia, which Lilia Shevtsova once called an advanced combat unit of the new global authoritarianism. It would set back, if not cripple, the axis of autocracy between Russia and China that Xi and Putin signed on February 4th. It would possibly set in motion, this is possible, changes within China itself, where the CCP's performance legitimacy is now being eroded by a sharp drop in economic growth, and she is coming under criticism in the lead-up to the 20th Party Congress in November for his no-limits deal with Putin and the harsh isolation procedures of his zero-COVID policy. Ukraine's successful resistance could also embolden Democrats in other regions. It could possibly even reverse the 16-year decline of democracy that has been charted by Freedom House. Samuel Huntington noted in his famous book on the third wave of democratization that the second wave of democratization began in 1943, not 45 after the war, but in 43, when the tide of battle in Europe began to change in favor of the Allies. Major wars can have that effect, since they shift the political and geopolitical currents in the world that affect the struggle for democracy. This war, as Larry Diamond has said, has the potential to be a hinge of history. Aside from Ukraine, no country will be more affected by this war and its outcome than Russia. At the present time, attitudes toward Russia in Europe are understandably very negative and hostile. A new report from the European Council on Foreign Relations, based on a pan-European poll, suggests that the break with Russia is irreversible, according to the report's co-author Ivan Krastev. The pent-up hostility toward Russia in some countries has been vividly expressed in the messages inscribed on munitions provided to Ukraine. The inscription on the missiles from the Czech Republic reads, "For the execution of the Prague Spring in 1968. The Dutch have written revenge for MH17 on the shells they've sent to Ukraine. And the Poles have signed ammunition with the bitter rebuke for Katyn. But we have to leave open the possibility that Russia can change, and that its traumatic defeat, because this can happen no other way, Russia changing, will lead to a new reckoning with history and the enduring legacy of Russian imperialism that was made more inhuman when communist totalitarianism separated Russia from its rich cultural, religious, and intellectual traditions that the communists considered the residue, the reactionary residue of the country's feudal past. It's not impossible. Is it? Is it impossible that Russians can come to the realization that stoking the embers of empire, in the words of Kenya's ambassador to the UN, Martin Kimani, will lead to the country's total ruin, where Putin is taking it right now? Surely Europe and the United States can remember that Russia has produced great writers and heroes like Andrei Sakharov, whose name is enshrined in the European Parliament's Human Rights Award, and that dissidents like Alexei Navalny and Vladimir Kara-Murza, whom Putin has poisoned and now imprisoned, and who have defined moral courage for a new generation of Russians, can play a role in shaping their country's future. Earlier today, Dr. Barroso said that Russia is a fact. But I raised the question, what kind of Russia? Russia doesn't need to be Putin's imperialist, expansionist, aggressive Russia. It doesn't need to be that way. And we should hope and try to act in a way that will encourage that change. And Ukraine's winning the war and Russia's losing the war are the preconditions for that happening. So these hopeful possibilities and the security threat that Russia continues to pose indicate the enormity of what's at stake and how much of a stake the West has in the outcome of this war. Putin is counting on the resolve, and we've heard about it today, of the US and the EU weakening in the months ahead as energy prices rise and inflation and food shortages get worse. And Boris Johnson has just warned of Ukraine fatigue. The danger is real, but given the stakes and the fact that it is Ukraine, not we, it is Ukraine that is paying the ultimate price in deaths to defend our values and our common future. This is a test that the West can and must, in my view, meet. The alternative would be a moral and strategic defeat for democracy and for the cause of peace throughout the world. This nightmare can end. Ukraine can be rebuilt. It must be rebuilt. And Russia, with the example of a democratic Ukraine just across the border, can conceivably become, over time, a normal country and part of a Europe that is whole and free. This vision can come to pass, but only if we stay the course. And may it show that the suffering and the sacrifice of the brave people of Ukraine have served a higher purpose of Ukraine, for Europe, and for the benefit of us all. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Gershman, for your inspiring words, your very interesting analysis on the situation in Ukraine, and for giving us so much food for thought, not only for this session, but for the next days. I would like to also welcome in the panel Professor Clifford Owen, to my right, Professor Gianodia, and Dr. Wilhelm Hofmeister. They will be introduced by my colleague, Professor Monica Diaz, who is, as you all know, the Dean for our PhD program at the Institute, and she will share the session. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much. And I have to say that I can think of no better way to honor the memory of Ralph Dahrendorf than this excellent lecture we just heard, considering not only the topic, but especially Professor Karl Gershman's thoughtful and sharp and also provoking words. Thank you so much for sharing this with us. That would be, in fact, in the spirit of Dahrendorf's writings and thinking, who, by the way, did also inspire our director, Professor João Carlos Spade, and who is the inspiration also for our Institute of Political Studies. And in the same way, we have to say that a debate with our guest professors and friends is also much more than a monument, the best living way to honor the enduring legacy of Ralph Dahrendorf. This discussion, especially with all our students who are here present and so lively present, this is really a joy for all of us, and we are very proud of that as well. In 2003, Ralph Dahrendorf published a book that was precisely called In Search of a New World Order for the 21st Century. And in fact, as if he had known what would be coming in this century that had already experienced so many conflict situations, war, and again, today, this extreme situation that we're challenging now, and that is really an expression of the confrontation of liberty, freedom, democracy, and authoritarianism, as you explained so well by reminding us of the life of Ralph Dahrendorf, who experienced, in fact, throughout his whole life, these movements between totalitarianism, authoritarianism, but also democracy and freedom, and especially open societies. So now here we are at this panel, and we have, as I mentioned, three very, very distinguished professors coming from Georgia, Canada, and Germany, a sort of G3 of the most excellent way to discuss this topic, and also friends of the Institute for a very, very long time. So again, this will be a very important moment, and also a moment of great and enriching experience for all of us here. So we have Professor Clifford Owen coming from Toronto University, Professor Guy Nodia from, who is the director of the International School of Caucasus Studies coming from Georgia, and of course also Dr. Wilhelm Hofmeister from, who was a former director of the Spain and Portugal section of the Konrad Adenauer Foundation. So three very different constellations from one side and the other side of the Atlantic, but looking at exactly the same question that was so well enhanced here by Professor Gershman. With no further ado, get prepared for a great debate, and I open the floor with Professor Clifford Owen from his perspective from Canada, but not only. The floor is yours.
Thanks, Monica. I want to join other speakers in congratulating João Espada on the 30th anniversary of this meeting. I first attended 25 years ago. I'm sorry to have missed the first 5. And my thanks to Karl Gershman for his eloquent and powerful speech. In its combination of rigorous analysis with a staunch commitment to democratic principles, it was a fine example of the standard to which this conference aspires. Do the Portuguese present know the American expression, from your mouth to God's ear? From your mouth to God's ear? It conveys the heartfelt wish that what someone else has just said will come to pass, but a certain doubt as to whether it is likely that it will do so. There are 2 points on which I'm in perfect agreement with Karl: that the Ukrainians deserve to win, just as the Russians deserve to lose, and that their victory would benefit not just themselves, but all free and democratic nations. Therefore, I agree with Karl that the Western democracies should lend Ukraine all reasonable support. Yet reasonable is a qualifier here. It precludes, in the first instance, any actual military engagement with the Russians, the world's foremost nuclear power. This is a considerable reservation. Consider, for instance, previous American efforts to enable fellow democracies to prevail against authoritarian foes by providing them with military, financial, and humanitarian assistance. The 2 greatest such cases were the 2 world wars, in both of which the United States practiced what was technically neutrality, thus avoiding war with Germany, while arming Britain to the maximum extent permitted under such a policy. In both cases, the policy succeeded in enabling Britain to stave off defeat. In neither did it enable her to achieve victory, nor therefore did either policy succeed in keeping America out of war. Rather, both ended up dragging her into it. No 2 wars are the same, of course, and this is only one of several outcomes that can be imagined for the current one. But it is highly possible that Allied support short of war, while clearly necessary for Ukrainian victory, will prove insufficient for one. Wars are unpredictable, and poor as the performance of the Russians has been so far, they still enjoy enormous advantages in numbers, weapons, and let's not forget sheer ruthlessness. While there are certainly grounds for hope in Ukrainian victory, these fall far short of grounds for confidence in one. Ukraine may be defeated despite our support, or the war may drag on as a stalemate, with Ukraine failing to regain either the territories already lost in it or those earlier seized by the Russians. In neither case will Ukraine have delivered the victory for which Karl and the rest of us so devoutly wish. In both, the outcome of the war will have proved as demoralizing for the cause of democracy as Karl hopes for it to prove remoralizing. None of which qualifies the argument for strong support of Ukraine. Again, we should help it as much as we reasonably can. Karl is thus further correct in suggesting that this war is a test for us as well as for the Ukrainians. How are we doing? Not as badly as might have been surmised, and as Putin presumably surmised. NATO is held together, more or less, with the Turks and the Hungarians the predictable outliers. And yes, it even shows signs of a certain reinvigoration, with Sweden and Finland signing on, and so many countries pledging to do better in meeting their quota of military spending, as well as to wean themselves from their dependence on Russian energy. The level of support for Ukraine has been heartening. But Olaf Scholz's striking phrase notwithstanding, it is much too early to brand this an historical turning point. So far, the West, unlike the Ukrainians, has hardly been tested. Putin is said to doubt that Western countries will stay the course. He's been wrong about so many things in this war. Might he actually prove right about this one? According to Karl, quote, if the Russian invasion signaled the beginning of a new era of greater vigilance in defending Western security, Ukraine's courageous resistance to the invasion had the effect of reviving democratic morale after an extended period of democratic crisis and seemingly inexorable authoritarian advance, unquote. Might Karl be too hopeful here? Look at the outcome of the recent French legislative election, which could hardly have been worse for Karl's and our side. Both the French far right and the French far left registered large gains, costing Monsieur Macron his majority in the National Assembly. This past week, Mrs. Orwin and I were in Provence, the 42 districts of which returned 21 Le Penian delegates, up from 0 in 2017. Neither Le Pen's nor Mélenchon's party is committed to France remaining in NATO, let alone to military support of this war. Not that leaving Ukraine hanging was uppermost in the mind of many of the voters who supported either party, or that of the even more pro-Putin Eric Zemmour. Still, a majority of French voters supported a party that favored leaving Ukraine hanging. Also worrisome was the historically low turnout, not a sign of a renewed commitment to democracy. As for Macron, his stature as a leader of the anti-Russian coalition will now be sorely diminished. None of this is good news for Ukraine. While the usual pathologies of French politics were on display in this election, they are merely Gallic versions of those of Western politics generally. What prevailed in France was not concern with the outcome of the war, but discontent with the war's domestic consequences. Is France an outlier here, or has it merely reverted to the liberal democratic mean? Pocketbook issues usually come first, and high food and fuel prices will almost certainly persist throughout the liberal democratic world for as long as the war does. This is why some Western politicians, especially those most dependent on Russia for energy, have already been pressing for negotiations, despite the current unwelcomeness of these to Ukraine. These tensions are bound to continue, and as they rise, so will the possibility of a falling out between Ukraine and the Western nations supporting it. I occasionally try to put myself in Vladimir Putin's shoes, although as thought experiments go, this isn't an enjoyable one. If I were him, I would further focus my forces to achieve Russia's further incremental progress. And after a little more of it, I would flummox the West by declaring victory. To my fellow Russians, I would emphasize that Russia now enjoyed a land bridge to the Crimea, that with both Luhansk and Donetsk oblasts now entirely in Russian hands, their inhabitants were finally safe from Ukrainian aggression, and the territories ripe for annexation. Control of Mariupol and so much of the rest of southern Ukraine, the Russification of which is already underway, would be so much icing on the cake. True, Ukraine would never agree to any of this, but then neither had it agreed to the annexation of Crimea or the establishment of the so-called Donbass republics back in 2014 and 2015. Neither would the West recognize these further encroachments, just as it did not the earlier ones. But would Western resolve to support Ukraine militarily persist despite the suspension of further Russian aggression? I don't doubt that Putin began the war with the intention of reclaiming the whole of Ukraine. But with that project having failed so abysmally, shouldn't he settle for half a loaf? Would the West prove equal to this particular test? I once heard a speech by Adam Michnik, a leading Polish dissident and journalist whom I'd always admired. During the question period, I asked him whether the dissident movement might serve as an inspiration for the established liberal democracies. His reply was not encouraging. Quote, "Our problems were our problems. You must find your inspiration from within yourselves." End of quote. The problems besetting the Western democracies have been gathering for a long time now and are primarily domestic rather than foreign. Here I agree with Bill Galston. They will survive even the most successful possible conclusion to the present war. Will it have achieved a lasting revitalization of the Western democracies? Considerable caution seems appropriate here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Orwin, especially for respecting the time so that we all will have chances to debate. And I hope that Professor Niagodia will also respect this. The floor is yours. We're very interested to hear your perspective from the East.
Hello. Yeah, it works. Yes, I am very honored to be here on this kind of 30th edition, as several people said, and also on having a chance to comment on Carl's presentation, which was stimulating and inspiring. I cannot say I want to take issue with much what he said, so much as sort of comment on certain implications in his speech. First thing, which is most important, I want to stress is that and I think we will agree on that, I mean on this panel, is that enormous stakes of this war. So this war is not just kind of Russia's colonial war, as Timothy Snyder, for instance, said, that Russia wants to reclaim parts of its empire. Of course, it wants that. It's Russia's war on the West, as Putin quite openly says, and it's Putin's war on Western democracy, basically. So his object is Western democratic community, which he sees as a threat. And basically, by that level of support, quite a high level of support, which the West renders to Ukraine, it's also, in a way, accepted that challenge from Putin. So one could say that the West also understood this war as a challenge to itself. So in that sense, it is extremely important for the West to win. So, and of course for Ukraine to win, but Ukraine's victory will also be seen as a victory of the West, and Ukraine's defeat would be also seen as defeat of the West and defeat for democracy. So that linkage is that if Ukraine wins, it will be not guarantee, of course, but some kind of a realistic chance for ending this trend of democratic recession through which we are living, and giving some hope for resurgence, new resurgence of democracy it is, I think, very logical and valid link. Now, whether Cliff, I guess, is much more cautious about Karl's optimism, that's another point, but I guess that the definition of the stake is very important. But that's, I wanted actually to also comment on this paradoxical link that on the one hand, on the paradox that on the one hand, the war which is ongoing is a terrible calamity, and of course, Ambassador of Ukraine reminded us of different aspects of human disaster which it brought, and it's greatest such calamity since World War II. But at the same time, it did engender some sense of new optimism, and Karl is not the only person who expresses that. And so it's interesting also why and what is the ground for that. And of course, there are two interrelated sources of or aspects of that optimism. One about actual war and whether that Ukraine is winning or has a chance to win. But that's military aspect, and it's hard for me to comment on that. But another aspect of that optimism is that somehow Ukraine, the heroic resistance of Ukraine, served as an inspiration for the Western democratic community or international democratic community to get its act together and restored democratic morale, as Karl said. Why is that? What changed? So I just, one thing I want to say is that somehow I think this episode reminded us that democracy is something you have to fight for. It needs passion and it needs readiness to sacrifice. And basically history should, it's not something new, it's not a new idea. People did fight for democracy and sacrifice for democracy. But I think one of the problems was that, and the problem of maybe last couple of decades was that, we lost that sense in a way, that democracy became kind of something that taken for granted and some kind of more rational project. Democracy is about being reasonable. And that may be linked to, let's say so, this Fukuyama's end of history paradigm. I mean, I don't want to once again attack Fukuyama. Everybody likes to attack this end of history idea. But this essence of this idea is that democracy has won decisively the war of ideas. And so no reasonable people would reject democracy based on reason, right? And that was the idea. So that created this assumption that, okay, reasonable people would want democracy. And of course, it does not mean that democracy will prevail everywhere because not everybody is reasonable, right? So the opponents of democracy have passions based on tribal nationalism or religious fundamentalism or religious fanaticism, but democracy has reason on its side. So, I mean, ultimately that's a Hegelian idea, right? And therefore, so you can always persuade somehow non-democrats to become democrats. So democracy promotion is about persuasion, is about, technical assistance and consultancy, and so teaching people how to be democratic, how to arrange democratic procedures and institutions, and that's how democracy spreads. And all those things are, of course, useful, but somehow it took passion out of democracy, if you wish. And I guess, I mean, we discuss often, of course, also on these previous meetings here, that why is it that we have democratic recession and the backtracking of democracy, and of course the economic reasons and other reasons, and Bill Galston spoke about them today, but I think one of the reasons was exactly that somehow democracy was taken as a default system and you don't need to fight for it. So it's boring, and there is no excitement in democracy. So, and somehow I think this inspiration of Ukrainians that Ukrainians gave us through their heroic actions convinced us that, convinced democratic community to that democracy can unite us around something we really care for, that we cannot take it for granted. We need to fight for it. And if we talk about Russia, I think I have to respect time limits, but where Russia takes its passion for fighting, I guess Russia has been much more passionate and rejecting and resenting democracy than the West has, or international democratic community in defending democracy. So I think it's not just some imperial instinct, or that, you know, they somehow cannot live without Ukraine or something like that. I think it's on the Russian side, it's kind of resentment of democracy, of this kind of moral force of democracy, or moral superiority of democracy. So it's kind of war of ressentiment, if you wish, in Max Scheller's or Nietzsche's and Max Scheller's sense, that this kind of why should teach us what is good and what is bad. And in that sense, democracy and the democratic expansion or democratic successes have been the reason for the war, if you wish. So in the sense that Russia could not stand that Ukrainians are attracted by democracy and not by whatever Russia may attract anybody with. So I think that's that was where my comments.
Thank you very, very much.
Thank you, Pat.
Thank you so much, Professor Janodia, for sharing this viewpoints and to look at the question from a different angle. And I will now open the floor to, well, after West and East, now the center, the view from Berlin, but also from you, our dear friend, and Dr. Wilhelm Hofmeister. Welcome on board to more comments about this very difficult questions.
Really very difficult. Good afternoon. Thank you very much, Monica. Of course, I first want to congratulate Professor Jean Esparta, Rita Brito, Monica, and all the others who makes this SalaAtl political forum possible, and this for 30 years. This is really a big task, and my congratulations and also my thanks for inviting me again. Also, I'm not more the representative of the Konrad Adenauer Foundation. I continue to be linked to the foundation in several activities. When I was listening to Karl Gershman, I was thinking how times are changing. Who of us would have imagined Karl Gershman speaking half a year ago about military facilities, military action, weapons, combat capacities, and all this? I think this is a clear sign that things are changing brutally, and I would very much like to share the optimism of Karl Gershman, but I'm a little bit more skeptical about certain points. I have 3 points prepared. but I will not read it because times are changing so fast that even my draft paper from last week has changed in some parts. First, the war in Ukraine and the future of European democracy. We have seen that the Europeans needed some time to understand really what's going on in Ukraine. That it's not only an attack on Ukraine. In 2014, we tried to contain and to appease the situation without putting a lot of pressure on Russia. And now it took also for the Europeans some more days to understand what's going on than for the Americans. I think the Americans immediately understood very well what's going on and that we have to react in a very strong way. Unfortunately, the Europeans, and not at least, unfortunately, the Germans took a lot of time, took more time to understand what's going on. Now Scholz and politicians in Germany are talking about the Zeitenwende, but it takes time and again and again to foster the Ukrainian army with facilities and to help Ukraine in the military, but also in the political way. So I think the good aspect of all this is that America has come back to be the main promoter of democracy, because promotion of democracy does not only mean to talk about democracy. In this regard, European Union was very strong over the last decades, but now at a very moment when it comes to defend democracy with not only with words but also with weapons, then fortunately America, the United States, actually is in a situation where it can show some resistance. We don't know, and we have discussed about this in the previous session, we don't know how long the United States will be able to act in this way, and we also do not know, and even less, how long the Europeans will really continue to keep this position they show at the moment. We have talked already about the elections in France, and we have to wait for the winter. We have seen that all European governments make a lot of efforts to assume the costs, and at the moment the costs are still very low. It is 10 or 20 cents more for the fuel. But even the European societies apparently are not disposed or not prepared to pay this small price, or at least the governments do not trust their people, that the people will assume. But what will people do in the winter when it was said that it's Ukraine, not we, that pay the price for our values? But my question is, do we really realize the share of the price we have to pay, and are we really prepared to pay this? I think this is still in doubt. Unfortunately, we have seen over the last days another problem. Last week I was very hopeful when I saw the visit of Scholz, Draghi, Macron and Johannes in Kiev, promising European perspective to the Ukraine. And I was drafting in my paper that, of course, this means that also the Balkan states must be shown some kind of a European perspective. Unfortunately, the Bulgarian vote did impede to include North Macedonia, and the other Balkan states are not really at the moment on the same track. And I think this integration process, or this perspective of a European integration, will bring a lot of problems, because nobody is talking about it at the moment. Everybody says, okay, this will take some time until Ukraine is in. But this needs, we know all, this needs huge reforms of the European Union, and nobody is prepared to do this. And even with now a weaker France, and though I'm not so optimistic regarding the European capacity of resilience and defense of what's going on. The next point, I have my second point, the consequences of the war in Ukraine for the development of democracy worldwide. When we talk about defending our democratic values, who is sharing this point of view? The North Americans, Canada, US, the Europeans, the Western Europe or the European Union, Australia, New Zealand, Japan and Korea, and that's it. Yeah. All the other big called democracies, not only India, but also Indonesia, Brazil, Mexico, South Africa, Nigeria, and you call it, yeah, nobody actually is really taking a stand in this discussion. And we have the supply crisis affecting a lot of countries. Some are benefiting from it, and some more even are affected by this supply crisis. They expect more aid from Europe, because they do not expect really aid from Russia. But Europeans are not able at the moment to help these states. And so, unfortunately, we have eventually a situation that some of these half-democratic guys in power in all these countries mentioned will use the situation to continue with their more or less not very democratic behavior. So we have seen that this year, the first time, I think this year, I've read recently in a book, more countries with more than 1 million people are governed in a non-democratic way. So the decay of democracy is continuing, unfortunately. And this is a very complicated situation. And it's also, I will stop in a moment, it's also very complicated that we see some kind of inconsistency and some kind of flexibility to see authoritarian rulers. I have mentioned in my paper that in Germany, the Greens, half a year ago, they demanded not to participate in the World Championship in Qatar. Now the Green economy minister is going to Qatar to beg for gas from Qatar. So you see all these human rights and democracy issues are postponed at the moment. Yeah? And so this we know this consistency is an old one. Yeah? We always had relations with China, with Arab countries and so on. But this is a problem. Well, I cannot extend my ideas so long, so I will come to the last point. I have here, William Galston mentioned the responsibility of the left-wing parties with workers. I would say we here in the room have also a responsibility. I suppose that most of the people here in the room are more on the center or center-right of political parties, but we have unfortunately to see that everywhere where democracy is in problem, it's not only the blue-collar workers, but it's also the local social elite, or at least part of the social elites. So I think also the conservative parties, or the right-wing parties, or the center parties have to do a lot, and also those people who are now prepared to be the future elite of their societies, they have to be prepared to defend the democracy. And without this elite defending democracy, I think it's not possible to keep it going. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hofmeister, for these critical insights that are indeed difficult. And as you were speaking about the responsibility that we all have, this is the moment to now open to the floor and allow maybe 3 questions. Please come to the point, questions, and then finally we will have the answers and reactions of Professor Karl Gershman. So yes, please.
Thank you so much. Mr. Karl Gershman mentioned that now with the candidate status, the EU is tightened to Ukraine as has never been before. Why hasn't it been before? Is it this more about triggering Russia, or really about trying to bring into the European Union circle one of the most corrupt countries of Europe, one flawed democracy, one that has banned political parties and confiscated their property? Does Ukraine represent our values, or does it represent our interests? Also, you, sir, you have mentioned that Ukraine is fighting for our values. I'm sorry, but I think right now Ukrainians are not thinking about anything but for themselves. Are we masking their fight for survival with a fight for the so-called European values to justify our aid or interference? Thank you.
Thank you very much for your question. Another question, please. Yes, here, and then over there. Yeah, first. If you could say your name, that would be great. Here in the mic. Okay. Yes, please.
Thank you. I think we all agree that Ukraine should not have been invaded. I wonder, though, however, are we mischaracterizing Ukraine as a bastion of democracy because it was never considered to be a full democracy? And Zelensky, of course, has been a great military leader, but he was a populist. And so why are we making this an attack on Western democracy when it's an invasion of the country, which is Ukraine, and of Ukrainians? Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now, if we have two quick questions we can have here, Magda, and over there.
Thank you. Magda Ramal is my name. My question is regarding the lack of support from India, Indonesia, Nigeria, South Africa, Mozambique, Angola. Do you think it's related to a non-perfect or more imperfect democracy in these countries, or it has to do with being aligned with Russia because of aid to development or any other commercial or aid support? Thank you.
Yes, we can. Where? Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Thank you for the presentation and the questions that have already been raised.
Yeah.
I'm Julian. I'm one of the European student debaters. And my question is for Professor Gershon. And you've spoken very eloquently about the need for support for Ukraine. And my question is, how politically sustainable is this support? And in order for this support to be truly democratic, it needs to be, for Western democracies, so it needs to be support not just by decisions by the elite, but also like the citizenry has to buy into it. And we see, for example, in the recent French legislative elections that people are getting tired, and also like pocketbook issues are top of their mind, and I expect that to be the case as well in the US this autumn during the upcoming midterm elections. So my question is, like, how would you sell support for Ukraine to the average citizen who is now concerned with rising cost of living, inflation, and diminishing prospects?
Yes, please. Thank you very much. And Professor Gershman accepted one more question for this young gentleman here. Yes, please.
Afternoon. My name is Antonio, and as a topic, confronting the authoritarian. In the aftermath of the Cold War ending and the dissolution of the Soviet Union, we saw, instead of an easing of tensions between East and West, we saw a continuation of them. The NATO expanding, for good or for bad, towards Eastern Europe, and the continuation of the European Union into it too. In the aftermath, we saw the collapse of the Russian democracy and the rise of Putin. Today, we see that the sanctions by Europe and by the West in general towards Russia are causing the Russian populace, the youth that is generally pro-EU and pro-democratic, to flee to Georgia and other countries. And the remaining people who are increasingly being supportive of Putin, generally because of generational trauma coming from the mass oppression that they felt during the times of the Soviet, would it be argued that perhaps the West has pushed Russia into becoming more authoritarian, and due to its own mistakes by invading Ukraine, which is an unjustifiable action, and the sanctions that have come on top of it, that Russia in its future are decisively authoritarian?
Thank you very, very much. And after these questions, I give now the word back to... Well, there is this young lady here in the first floor. If you allow this, this was the last... yes. Thank you very much. So the floor is yours to react now and to answer or to take
well,
these
others
questions.
may want to say something, but since you're asking me, I'll first I want to thank Cliff for his very sharp counter-arguments, which give me, I need to respond to them. One is that I don't think there's a good parallel to be made between the Western countries staying out of direct confrontation with Russia and the United States and the 1930s with Nazi Germany, where we had Lend-Lease, but we didn't enter the war. I don't think there's a parallel, because I don't, first of all, think that that Russia is comparable to Nazi Germany and the threat that Nazi Germany presented to the entire world. I think Nazi Germany was much more dangerous in the 1930s and had much more power in the 1930s than Russia has today. Russia is a declining power. It's still a dangerous country, but it's a declining power, and Nazi Germany was not that way. And also, you can't compare Ukraine today with Great Britain in 1939, 1940. You know, at that time, they were obviously just fighting to stay alive and to prevent the Nazis from, you know, invading and bombing. Ukraine had, you know, really taking it to the Russians. And they did win the first 3 or 4 months of the war. We'll see what happens now. And you know, as I said, and I'll have another word to say about this, I think we're going to see a turn in the war in the next couple of months ahead. I just don't think it's a comparable situation. And then also on your point about Russia enjoys a land bridge, and Putin maybe should declare victory. You know, the current situation is not going to stay. There is as I pointed out, and you didn't address this, there is a very significant partisan movement, Russia never had adequate forces to occupy all of Ukraine. It cannot deal with a partisan movement, as you know, which is going to take, you know, serious losses on whatever forces they have in the south. It's already doing that, but it'll only get worse. And finally, it has taken a while to, for maybe the Western countries have been too slow in aiding Ukraine, in getting them the weapons that they need, but these are evidently really, really complex weapons, and it takes time. There aren't that many of these weapons. I'm talking about the multiple launch rocket systems. There are now 20 that have been pledged. This is the one where you may remember that Zelensky said, give us 60 of them and we'll defeat the Russians. Give us 40 of them and we'll slow them down considerably. Give us 20 of them and we'll increase their casualties. They've now getting pledged 20, but it's not the end of it. And they've been trained how to use these weapons, these really complex weapons. And I think it's going to reverse the course of the war over the next couple of months. And you're going to see both a driving back of the Russians, both because of the partisan struggle, the guerrilla struggle in the occupied territories, but then also these rocket systems are going to inflict serious damage on the main advantage which the Russians have now, which is artillery. And look, the Russians, everything we know about them is that they're an exhausted force. Frederick Kagan called them a spent force, and there are just a lot of, if you read the specialists, this is what you pick up in terms of what, and that I just want to really underline the importance of the fact that Putin has still, until this point, not called it a war, not had a mass mobilization, and he can't. That's actually rather significant. Finally, on the question, maybe I'll just answer one other question on Ukraine. And Miroslava will talk about this more tomorrow. She can say something about it now. But it's a big mistake to sort of see Ukraine as, a country represented by the oligarchs, a country that is, hopelessly corrupt. I mean, there has been a struggle going on in Ukraine since it became independent. Miroslava, who is sitting here, her husband was murdered by the Kuchma government in Ukraine in 2000 for exposing corruption. there are activists in Ukraine who have struggled to fight against the corruption, to fight for more democratic government. This is a long and difficult process. You know, when you have communism, you just don't overthrow a regime. It takes a long time to build democracy, and Ukraine has been engaged in that struggle. You know, you had the demonstrations when Georgy Gangadze was murdered, and then you had the Orange Revolution. Then you had the Euromaidan, the Revolution of Dignity in 2013 and 2014. And now you have, you know, what's going on now. And I might note, by the way, in response to the question about NATO and the way the U.S. has provoked some of this, what has caused, in my view, the Euromaidan, the revolution of the Euromaidan, what has caused Ukrainian support for NATO, because it didn't always support joining NATO. You know, at the time before the Euromaidan, it was minority support for joining NATO in Ukraine. What has caused Ukraine, which was a divided country between Western Ukraine and Eastern Ukraine, to become a unified nation, one person has contributed to that, and it's Vladimir Putin. He's also, you know, unified the West. He has, in addition to unifying the West, he's you know, brought NATO and Finland into NATO, and he may, in the end, we don't know, but I was suggesting this before, he may in the end lead to his worst nightmare. You know, a stronger Ukraine that's part of Europe, and possibly, conceivably, given the failure, the existential, systemic failure of what he has done with this war, ultimately lead to not his own downfall, because I don't think that's the important issue, but it's whether or not this can lead to the end of Imperial Russia. And I think it might. One last thought on Fukuyama. He might have been too optimistic about the end of history. Let's hope he's not too optimistic about Ukraine. He is he likes to stake out provocative positions. And on Ukraine, he's very deeply involved in Ukraine training. He's trained well over 150 Ukrainian second-level specialists in government, because he believes in governance, and he's very deeply committed to Ukraine. And he's the one who's been out front taking the optimistic view on this. I don't think he's wrong, but I guess this is the last point. Of course, you know, we're a long, long way from victory on this, and obviously there is going to be Ukraine fatigue, all of these problems. It is just my hope that the stakes are such that the political will can be maintained to win this fight. It's not as if, you know, if Portugal were being attacked, obviously Portugal would resist. Portugal is not being attacked. It's sort of one step removed, and it's one step removed in the United States. That makes it more difficult, and so but there has to be a political struggle taking place in all of these countries to say, and I think, you know, Guillaume was saying this, there are enormous interests that are at stake here, and values that are at stake here, and we just, you know, this is a political battle here as well as in Ukraine, and this is a battle we have to win. It's not determined. Nothing is determined, but this is a battle that can be won, I think, because the stakes are so high.
So, after these wise, thoughtful, and also words that ask more questions, we will certainly go on in the next panel, and the next panel, and the next. So we have 2 more days to go with many, many questions and interesting debates, I'm very sure. I thank all the members of this panel, and especially you, Professor Karl Gershman, and of course, who brought this memory of Ralph Dahrendorf in the best way, and we will continue.
Can I just, yes. We're having a Churchill dinner tonight, so I just really wanted to read a quote from Churchill about Finland. In 1940, you know, Finland resisted. The real comparison is Finland in 1940 and Ukraine today. And If you just put in this quote from Churchill, Ukraine today, I think it's sort of a good way to summarize this discussion. And he said, Finland, superb, nay, sublime. In the jaws of peril, Finland shows what free people can do. The service rendered by Finland to mankind is magnificent. And I think, you could say that about Ukraine today.
Thank you very much, Churchill over there. And I would like to ask everyone to go to the garden session now. Thank you so much.